allegations: abuse of power, bribery, and retaliation, all perpetrated by the top law enforcement officer in the Lone Star State. In truly historic fashion, the Texas House finds probable cause for trial and votes overwhelmingly to impeach Attorney General Ken Paxton. 65 days out from a final reckoning before the Senate, a critical question looms. Will justice or hardball politics prevail? I'm Greg Grugan, and welcome to What's Your Point, where our panelists call it like they see it. Let's greet them. Starting us off, Rice political analyst Mark Jones. Next up, Fox 26 senior legal analyst Chris Tritico. In the 3 spot, well-known Houston businessman, columnist, and attorney Bill King. Batting cleanup, longtime conservative commentator and Houston attorney Gary Polland. Let's begin. On the afternoon of May 27th, history was made at the state capitol. It was there on the floor of the Texas House that lawmakers approved 20 articles of impeachment against State Attorney General Ken Paxton. Never before had the Lone Star State's top law enforcement officer faced removal by the legislature. The margin proved overwhelming, with 121 of 149 members voting in favor of the case moving to trial in the Senate.
But members, no one person should be above the law, least not the top law enforcement official of the state of Texas.
And either this is going to be the beginning of the end of his criminal reign, or God help us with the harms that will come to all Texans if he is allowed to stay.
It was a reckoning by legislative standards at light speed, which Paxton supporters claimed lacked transparency, reviewable evidence, and any semblance of due process for the embattled Attorney General.
And what you're being asked to do today is to impeach without evidence. It is all rumor, it is all innuendo, it is all speculation. It's what I call the hang 'em now and judge 'em later policy.
Important to note that the House launched its mostly secret investigation after Paxton sought $3.3 million public dollars to settle a lawsuit lodged by his whistleblowing former employees. And with that, I turn to Chris Tritico. You've been watching this unfold. What's your take?
Well, so let's remember that in the impeachment process is more like a grand jury, if you will, and the House committee was investigating this through the session, and the fact that they came at the end is the way our legislature in Texas works. They do most of their work in the last month of the legislative session. The griping by some Republican members of the House, I don't find to be credible, to be honest with you. They come out and say there's no due process here, which we hear from Trump supporters during the Trump impeachment process. But they did do their investigation. They reported out to the House. Here's our articles of impeachment. Now let's vote on these. I find that process to be the way all impeachment processes work in any House of Representatives. And so I don't find anything uncredible about that process.
All right, Gary Polland. Ken Paxton's been shrouded in smoke, so to speak, in terms of criminality, playing fast and loose with the rules for quite some time. Did he get a fair shake from the House?
I think he did. It's the functional equivalent of how the criminal justice system works in Texas and many states. We have a grand jury. The grand juries review felonies. They decide if there's probable cause. Understanding, Greg, that is a low standard, right? So in this case, the House managers, they came up with probable cause. I don't think any person with any sense can say, oh, there wasn't probable cause to indict. There was. There was not evidence to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt, which is now the standard. That's going to happen at the trial, just like we deal every day in the courthouse. I mean, I'd like to see more input in the grand jury for defense lawyers, but Texas doesn't allow it. Same thing happened here. So this is an argument without any substance. They're just not right, and I think that's one of the reasons the vote was so overwhelming that there was sufficient evidence to go forward.
Bill King, I was talking to you as this unfolded. Were you surprised that the House took this kind of decisive action when they got an opening?
Look, I think Chris and Gary have explained the process very well to non-lawyers, which is this was not a trial. This was like a grand jury proceeding. There's not a lot of due process in a grand jury proceeding, you know. And so this is to determine whether or not there's enough evidence to actually have a trial. And the House found overwhelmingly that there was. I thought the most interesting thing to me about the debate in the House was that nobody defended Paxton on a substantive basis. They attacked the attackers, they attacked the process, they griped about the procedure, but nobody got up and said, hey, he didn't do any of these things and provided any evidence to that end. That's generally a sign that you've got a pretty weak defense.
All right, Mark Jones, when this started to unfold, I went to you, I said, where is this headed, and how much does Dan Patrick, the Lieutenant Governor, and Greg Abbott have to be on board for this to proceed in any meaningful way?
Well, I think Abbott's been on board from the beginning. Abbott has wanted to get rid of Paxton for some time. He didn't want to go out there in public and essentially support one of his opponents in the past Republican primary, such as Eva Guzman or George P. Bush, but he's quite happy with him leaving. I think a lot of the power now rests with Dan Patrick. He's shown that over the course of this session and past sessions that he has a pretty strong control over the Senate. And if he wants to steer it towards acquittal, he probably can do so. If he wants to steer it towards impeachment, he can do so. Or he can stand back and let the chips fall where they may and let the senators decide, which is unlike the case in the House where the Speaker, Dade Phelan, did a pretty aggressive job of pressuring Republican House members to vote for the articles of impeachment. That is, he didn't adopt a neutral position. He pressured them with potential, at least latent or implicit threats that if they did not vote the right way, they might suffer later on in terms of favored legislation or committee assignments.
All right, Chris Tritico, Team Paxton has complained that they weren't allowed to provide testimony or evidence before the House committee. And if the House committee was kind of the first stage of the grand jury, do you have any problem with that he was not given proper due process at the beginning of this?
Well, first, he was invited to testify before that committee, and he chose not to. And so don't turn down your opportunity to testify and then complain about the process, okay? He had the ability to testify. He chose to exercise his right to remain silent, which is his right. But then don't complain about the fact that you didn't.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Still to come, the potential whistleblower testimony that's landed Ken Paxton in so much hot water. And in our Sunday survey, we're asking viewers if they believe the prosecution of the Attorney General is justified or a political scheme to remove him from power. Tell us what you think. Vote on our webpage, fox26houston.com. Just click on poll at the top of the page or tell 26 using our news app. But up next, our powerful team of legal and political experts takes a hard look at the charges facing the top lawman in the Lone Star State. Welcome back. Bribery, abuse of power, misuse of official information, misuse of public resources, conspiracy, retaliation, and dereliction of sworn duty. A litany of alleged misdeeds Paxton and his defense team have categorically denied.
By proceeding with this illegal impeachment scheme to overturn a decision made by Texas voters just a few short months ago, the corrupt politicians in the Texas House are demonstrating that blind loyalty to Speaker Dade Phelan is more important than upholding their oath of office. They are determined to ignore the law.
Panel, suffice it to say, Ken Paxton didn't get in this position by accident or the result of an elaborate partisan scheme. So which of these allegations do you consider most substantial and potentially most compelling to a Senate jury? I'm going to start with you, Bill King.
I think probably the bribery counts were the ones that I'd be most worried about if I were him. Bribery is always a little tricky because you've got to prove a quid pro quo. You can't just get a campaign contribution and then go do a favor for somebody. That's not bribery. But in this case, there are a couple of things. One, supposedly this Nate Paul character gave his girlfriend, someone he was having an affair with, a job to sort of keep her quiet and keep her under control. And the second thing is he did a bunch of work on their house, like $100,000 worth. And you think back, those of you who've been around Harris County, think about Robert Eccles and Jerry Ebersol and other people that have gotten into trouble in that exact situation. By the way, when you get a gift like that, it doesn't have to be bribery. It can just be an illegal gift. So those are the two charges I'd be the most worried about if I were him.
Chris, you agree, or you see something else that's more serious?
So we have to look at these charges in two ways. Some of these are not crimes. Now, the burden of proof is still beyond a reasonable doubt, but some of these are not crimes, and they don't have to prove that a crime occurred to convict him and remove him from office. Those are the ones, to me, that are the most problematic for him, for Ken Paxton, the ones that don't amount to criminal conduct. And so when you just abuse your office and they can prove an abuse of office that's not a crime and remove you, that's the most problematic in the defense side of the thing to me. When you don't have to get that criminal conduct standard, and those are the things that I would be more worried about if I was Dan Cogdell.
All right, bribery certainly would be abuse of office, but I mean, Gary, do you agree with Chris that the standard is lower and still an impeachable offense?
I think Chris is right in that respect, but where I come down with this case, I think everything he had to do with Paul is tainted. Paul is just dirty as can be, and there are more problems that we'll talk about later of what Paxton's facing because of Paul's federal indictment. So what happened was he used state resources and put the state's thumb on the scale of a lawsuit in between Paul and a charity. Now, that's totally improper. The Attorney General's not there for private lawsuits. In addition, when he got rid of it, the whistleblowers, who were, by the way, all good conservative lawyers, who's told him to trying to protect him. They were doing that. They said, hey, we can't do this. And so the response ultimately by Attorney General is to get rid of him and get someone who'll tell him what he wanted to hear. And that is not the representation people wanted. I don't think that was ever even talked about seriously by voters when they considered whether they should vote for him or not. So, look, if he goes, we're going to have a conservative Attorney General. They're still going to sue Biden every day. It's not going to change. And what he has done on his performance of actual cases is really irrelevant. It's really pretty pathetic. I think the state's case is pretty compelling.
All right, we're going to leave it right there. When we come back, our examination of the serious allegations against Ken Paxton continues. Which of the charges poses the biggest threat of expulsion and potentially worse?
This will be a process that allows the public to fully examine everything. And I promise you, it's 10 times worse.
The people of the state of Texas are entitled to know whether their top cop is a crook.
Texas courthouse legends and Paxton impeachment prosecutors Rusty Hardin and Dick DeGuerin foreshadowing their case against the suspended Attorney General. Panel, let's continue our conversation about the criminal severity of the allegations, but I want to start with Mark Jones. You know, in terms of polling, is any of this sticking in the minds of the general public here in Texas?
Well, the general public's learning more about it, but when we're talking about the Republican senators who are going to be voting on this, they're really concerned about Republican primary voters. That's the group that they have to go back and face if they vote for impeachment. And that's where I think what they're thinking about is what topics are likely to resonate with those individuals that will provide them with cover if they vote to say that Paxton is guilty. And I think the affair and providing the job for the paramour via Nate Paul, plus the $100,000 or so for the remodeling, plus the essentially retribution against the whistleblowers, all of that, the more serious and the more that resonates with Republican primary voters, the more likely those senators are going to feel comfortable voting to impeach.
Bill King, as usual, you do your homework and you've been looking at these with a fine-tooth comb. What else sticks out to you?
Well, you know, about a quarter of the impeachment's about the securities case up in, I guess, in Collin County. Right. And it doesn't look like it's going to look at that. I think that was kind of just an add-on at the end. It's all about this relationship with Nate Paul, which we're going to be talking about some more in a minute. But there's something weird about that relationship, the degree to which he went out and talked the Travis County District Attorney's Office into issuing subpoenas to entities which had been subpoenaed by the FBI, you know, on the allegation that it was a fraudulent search warrant. I mean, this is just unheard of stuff for an attorney general to be doing, you know, for a friend of his especially.
All right, Chris Tritico, if you had gotten in the call and the House had hired you or the Senate had hired you to prosecute this case, based upon what you know now, would you think you had a pretty good shot of a conviction?
Well, I would be, just two ways you got to look at this. Yes, I think the evidence is pretty strong against against Ken Paxton, but this is and always will be a political process. And you're looking at jurors. We never know who our jury is going to be. Now we know not only who the jury is going to be, but we know what their politics is. We know who they're playing to, and so we can hone our case to them because we know who they're answering to. But this is a political process, and it always will be a political process. We can look at prior impeachment, prior removal trials, and know how they voted straight up party lines. And so that's how they're going to try their case. They're looking at this as a political process, not a jury trial. And that's what these lawyers are looking at. And that's how they're analyzing their case.
Gary, you think there are 9 Republican senators that are going to look at this with an open mind? Because that's what it's going to take to get to the number.
Well, I'm optimistic that they're actually going to follow their oath, which is not that I'm going to put my finger up in the air and figure out where the political winds are blowing, figure out how much political donations I'll get no matter how I vote, but I actually need to listen to the evidence and decide whether or not the prosecution's proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. That's what's supposed to happen. Now, some of the senators I've talked to have told me that's exactly what they're going to do. They have an open mind. They want to hear what the evidence is. So that means that the trial could become very important in this case.
That sounds like a response filled with integrity. Are you confident that they're not going to?
Nah, I mean, well, I think one of the things that we can't forget about is that there's nothing new in these articles of impeachment that we didn't know a year ago, if longer. But back during the spring of 2022, Republicans across the state of Texas had an opportunity to support a very high-quality candidate, Neva Guzman, a reasonably high-quality candidate, George P. Bush, and Louis Gohmert. One of those things. And at the end of the day, Paxton won that primary, finished in the first, and then won the runoff. So there's not much new here. This is very political.
Gonna leave it there. Up next, the ground rules now set for a monumental courtroom clash on the floor of the Texas Senate. Will the guidelines give defense or prosecution a tactical advantage?
You're united to take an oath so that justice prevails, that everyone will do their job to the utmost in fairness in this impeachment trial upcoming in September. I've never been more proud of the members on this floor than how you came together on this set of rules and how seriously you're taking your responsibilities.
The trial of Attorney General Ken Paxton is set to begin September 5th, and the upper chamber has adopted a series of rules for the proceeding. The defendant in this case must appear in person. Both sides will be allowed to call witnesses. Each side has been allotted 24 total hours to present evidence, the equivalent of 4 days. Significantly, the defense will be allowed to challenge each of the articles in pretrial motions with a majority vote required for dismissal. At the conclusion of the trial, the senators will vote on each article separately with a 2/3 vote required for conviction. Also of note, the upper chamber has determined Senator Angela Paxton, wife of the defendant, has been disqualified from casting a vote due to the obvious conflict of interest. Panel, assess the playing field here, given the opportunity for pre-trial challenges. Could this trial be short-circuited before it ever gets to the merits? And I'm going to turn to you, Bill King, because you've talked about this.
I think it very well could be. I found it very interesting, all the rules about the motion to dismiss. There's going to be a motion to dismiss based on some Texas law that says you cannot be impeached for something that occurred before you were elected. Now, it's different. There's what's called statutory impeachments and constitutional impeachments. In statutory impeachments, Supreme Court said you absolutely cannot be impeached for something that happened before your last election. It's called the voter forgiveness rule. I think it's a terrible rule, but that's Supreme Court law today. Now, that doesn't bind the Texas Senate on a constitutional impeachment, which this is. But if you're in the Senate, you don't want to go through this trial, you don't want to hear all this testimony, you want to just get rid of this, a real easy way to say, well, you know, we really need to defer to the Supreme Court and dismiss this. I think it's a very good possibility that's what's going to happen.
Gary Polland, you agree that the Senate could punt?
Well, I think the securities fraud cases are going to go down the toilet. They're just not there, and that clearly is well before he got elected the first time. I don't know. I don't think they're going to grant a summary judgment, the functional equivalent of a summary judgment on everything and flush the case because of the public perception of cover-up. So I think there's going to be a trial, and I think that it's going to be up to the prosecution to make the case and the defense to show that they don't have a case, understanding that the burden beyond a reasonable doubt is high.
Chris, agree, disagree?
Well, I think the securities fraud counts have already been abated by the rules already. And so the motions to dismiss will be filed. I don't know if the case will be maybe shortened, in other words, partially granted, or all of it taken out. I highly doubt that the Senate will kick the whole case. They may parse out part of it and go to trial on a shorter case, on a smaller case. That would be the most likely outcome to me, that they'll grant part of it maybe and let it go to trial on a smaller case than the whole case.
Yeah, just the fact that it takes only a majority vote here, does that play in, Chris?
Well, it takes no, not to me. Well, yes, I think that makes a big difference on the majority vote for that. But to me, the issue becomes, what does the Lieutenant Governor want? In my view, if he wants this to go away, it's going to go away. If he doesn't, then it's not.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Still ahead, the whistleblower accounts in the case against Ken Paxton. Could eyewitness testimony from the Attorney General's top aides convince reluctant Republicans to convict? Welcome back. At the core of the case against Ken Paxton are 8 former top aides to the suspended Attorney General, all of whom blew the whistle on the boss, accusing him of bribery and abuse of office. By all accounts, the 8 individuals are career public servants with sound track records and conservative credentials. More importantly, they are said to possess firsthand knowledge of Paxton's alleged wrongdoing, and their testimony before the Senate could prove pivotal. Panel conviction on a single article of impeachment is all that's required to expel Mr. Paxton from office permanently. Could these witnesses be the key? I ask you, Chris Tritico.
Absolutely. This testimony could be very, very key to the case. It could be very compelling testimony. Probably the most compelling testimony in the whole case is going to come from these 8 witnesses, because they were talking with Ken Paxton about these issues, telling him, don't do this. That's going to be very compelling testimony. And it may not go to the core of what these articles are about, but it's going to put the senators in the room with Ken Paxton right before these people got fired. And that's going to be compelling.
Yeah, Gary, putting a face on the allegation and people who took a stand, can that be a compelling component of convincing an intransigent Republican senator that, hey, this was wrong, we can't let this stand?
I think that if they are compelling, the Republican base in each of these districts is not going to be very happy with what he was doing there, making the office basically his own private fiefdom. The fact he ran through all those stoplights with 8 conservative lawyers telling him no, and it's not just that, Greg. You go on, and what he did is then fire them and instruct other people to tell him what he wanted to hear so he could go forward and do the stupid things he wasn't supposed to do. They were there to protect him and to protect the agency, and he didn't realize or didn't want to realize they were protecting him. That's how he ended up in this situation.
Bill King, how much weight do you think these whistleblowers will hold, or their testimony?
I'm not as convinced as Gary and Chris are about this. They apparently did not know about the girlfriend getting the job or about the work done on the house, to me, which are sort of the smoking guns in this case. They knew that this relationship with Nate Paul was just, I mean, it smelled so bad. From any lawyer in that situation would think that. But when I was going through the memo that was written about their firing, and these are very technical legal arguments about what he was doing and not doing, what he had the power to do and not do. I'm not sure the general public's going to follow all that. I think most lawyers like us read it and we're offended and it's just awful and all that. I'm not sure the public's going to have the same reaction to it.
Mark, what are the political risks for Republican senators in strong red districts if they, who may have lined up as a vote in favor of Paxton, change their mind?
Well, I mean, luckily only about 1/3 of them have to face re-election in 2024. So those are the ones who have to be most concerned, because if you vote to impeach the Attorney General, you're pretty much inviting a Republican challenge. The others get to wait until 2026, where this may have died down or they may not be running for election. But I think what's going to be important for this trial is not as much, I think that I'm somewhat cynical. I don't think that the politicians are going to be persuaded by a compelling testimony, but it may be persuadable for the base and Republicans that the more they hear of negative things about Paxton, the less likely they are to punish or try to push the senator to vote for acquittal, and the more willing they are to accept the fact that he committed some pretty egregious acts and that he should be impeached.
Do you think that Patrick, the lieutenant governor, and Governor Abbott might have to provide some of these folks political cover with the base?
Well, I mean, certainly I think if the lieutenant governor wants to vote for impeachment, we're likely to see probably a near universal impeachment. Not everyone, but most people. So that would be political cover. And certainly if the lieutenant governor is not going to go after you and is going to protect you, that would be cover. If I were a senator, I probably wouldn't count on Abbott's support as much because he sometimes is there and sometimes not.
All right. Gary, do you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think the politics are interesting, and you have the forces of big money on both sides divided in the Republican Party. One side is for impeachment, the other side's against impeachment. One side threatens, if you vote the wrong way, I'm coming against you. The other side said, you vote right, we'll give you money. So I think it all washes out at the end. Unlike some people on the panel, I have faith. I actually think these people will take their oath seriously, like we expect our jurors to do in our courthouse.
Got to leave it there. Still to come, a clash of legal heavyweights coming. Will big-time lawyers on both sides of this case generate epic courtroom theater? But up next, the co-conspirator in so many of Ken Paxton's acts of alleged corruption. What role could indicted campaign contributor Nate Paul play in the impeachment trial to come? Welcome back. At the center of a slew of allegations aimed at Ken Paxton, you will find the Attorney General's relationship with Austin real estate developer Nate Paul. Time after time, Paxton allegedly bent or potentially broke the law on behalf of the businessman who investigators say repaid the state's top law enforcement officer with five-figure donations, a job for his mistress, and cash-equivalent bribes. Earlier this month, Paul was indicted and arraigned on multiple federal financial fraud charges unrelated to his relationship with Paxton. Panel 1 has to wonder what, if any, plea deal could be contingent on his cooperation in the Paxton case. What do you think, Chris Tritico?
Well, so there's a lot of factors at play here. Now, if he comes in and exercises his right to remain silent in Ken Paxton's trial in the Senate, then the senators are not going to be allowed to utilize that. Now, there's a Texas statute that says this is a civil proceeding, and under Texas law, they can use Ken Paxton's silence as a circumstance against him. Ken Paxton's silence, if he chooses not to testify. There is no statute specifically addressing Nate Paul's silence. So if he chooses to remain silent, there's going to be a pretrial motion about whether or not his silence is a circumstance against Ken Paxton. And there will be motions on that. And that goes to the Lieutenant Governor to decide on that issue.
Gary, do you think the U.S. Attorney's is approaching Nate Paul's counsel and saying, want to make a deal?
I think Nate Paul's counsel is approaching the U.S. Attorney. Look, here's what Nate Paul has. In federal prosecution, as everybody knows, you have currency. Well, in this case, Nate Paul has currency. There's someone ahead in the food chain that the feds are interested in. So he can trade that. But he can only trade it as long as Paxton's still in play. So if he says nothing and Paxton goes to trial and is convicted, then Nate Paul's got nothing. They don't care their interest on Paxton goes way down. And then on the other hand, you also have Paxton. If Paxton is a target of the feds and they plan to indict him, the only thing Paxton has to trade if he is indicted is his resignation and agreement not to run for political office again. If he's convicted of his impeachment, he doesn't have anything to trade. That's it. So then what happens in federal court is everybody knows with those cases, if you get convicted, you're probably going to prison. So these are things that weigh, and that comes into the Fifth Amendment. If Paxton doesn't testify and tell his story, who does? Because if you're his lawyer in the potential federal case, you're going to say, take the Fifth Amendment. You can't testify. Are you kidding? They're going to use it against you. But on the other hand, you don't testify, as Chris correctly pointed out, that factor will be used against him in the impeachment.
Bill King, what are the chances we see Nate Paul as a witness in this case?
I think zero. His lawyer's not going to testify. He's been charged with a relatively minor federal crime, which is making a false statement with financial statements. I think that was done intentionally because that's a case, that is a charge you can do a plea bargain on. Generally, the feds want you, if they're going to do a deal with you, they want you to plead guilty to something. They get him to plead guilty to that, and he could get probated sentence or whatever. I'm sure that they have many other more serious charges they could bring against him. So I think what's going on right now is they're saying, look, can you help us, or should we just go ahead and get out the rest of these charges and bring him? That's the leverage they got over him right now. So yeah, I think he's under intense pressure to make a deal. Question is, what is that deal going to be, and what would he say?
We'll keep an eye on it. Still ahead. Batten down the hatches. Hardin and DeGuerin versus Busby and Cogdill. Will big courtroom personalities and talent inevitably trigger fireworks in the Senate trial to come?
Paxton will never be convicted by the Senate. Not on this evidence, not with this record.
To say this case is not about politics has the credibility, the believability, and the sincerity of the fellow that's trying to convince his wife that he goes to the strip joint for the food. It's not about the naked women.
The Texas Capitol is a big building, and that's a good thing given the courthouse reputations and, yes, I'm going to say it, the egos of opposing counsel in this Senate trial. Rusty Hardin and Dick DeGuerin for the prosecution, Tony Busby and Dan Cogdill for the defense. If the case gets to the merits, folks, I talked to insist swagger and some showboating are a near certainty on this truly historic, ultra high-profile stage. No voir dire of jurors, no appeals, winner take all, reputation-wise, with political flack aplenty, perversely impacting the fair administration of justice. Panel, can't wait to hear your thoughts, Chris Tritico.
This is, this is going to be an amazing political theater to watch. I'm chomping at the bit. Fortunately, it's going to be live streamed so we can all watch it. And the rules say that the lieutenant governor can appoint a lawyer familiar with the rules of evidence to sit and help him rule. Governor, I'm available to be there with you and help you make rules.
All right, Gary, you expect political theater here?
I do, but if you read the rules, it's designed to try to minimize that, to take the focus off of the lawyers and showboating and focus on the merits of the case. And so that's what you expect to happen. In addition, you know that the lawyers are cut out of opening and closing arguments.
No, just the...
Well, for the state.
Yes.
For the state, they have to use the managers, which I think they'll do fine. But in addition, if you read the other rules, they don't want them talking to the media. There's all kinds of restrictions of what they want to do to make sure this doesn't become a circus. So I don't think Dan's going to put up with any antics from anybody. I think he's going to be very serious because his reputation is on the line and on trial too.
What do you expect, Bill?
I kind of agree with Gary. When you read through the rules, it's clear that they intend to have an iron grip. I think it's only 24 hours both sides have to present. You know, you're talking about 4 6-hour days. I mean,
we're not having 50 depositions like Tony said.
I mean, I've tried cases that are a lot more complicated than this, and didn't even get close to that. I mean, we went on for weeks in those trials. You know, so it's a very short time fuse, and it's clear that the rules that the Senate intends to keep this under as tight a control as they possibly can.
Mark Jones, you think this spectacle will draw a big audience across the state or a limited audience?
It'll draw an audience, but it's not going to draw, we can't get people to turn out in elections. I don't think we're going to be seeing them, tuning in and live streaming the Senate. I mean, the Senate, I think live stream will get better ratings than it ever has had before, but it's going to still be a very dedicated audience. Most of the information people will receive is the news reports on it that evening, and that's probably where we'll see these superstar lawyers in terms of speaking with the press to the extent possible, rather than actually watching in the courtroom. I think, though, I think in some cases you have to give Paxton a little bit of an advantage there because he's got Jose Altuve. The House has, I don't know, Craig Biggio or Joe Morgan. Which one would you want out on the field?
All right, legacy for these guys. Real quickly, Bill.
Yeah, I tend to think the lawyers are not going to play as big a role as they would probably like to play in this. That'd be my guess.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Up next, big stakes attracting big money. Will the clash of Republican mega donors play an outsized role in the ultimate outcome of Ken Paxton's impeachment trial? Welcome back. I suppose you could call it the war within the war. A rift within our state's dominant Republican Party between GOP mega donors. West Texas oil patch ultra-conservative billionaires Tim Dunn and the Wilkes brothers backing Paxton. Equally wealthy home builder Dick Weekly, founder of Texas Lawsuit Reform, appears to be pushing hard for Paxton's removal. Panel, big money talks and always has. And I dare say it will be talking directly into the ears of Texas senators throughout this process. Mark Jones, big forces at odds here.
Right. So on one hand, we have the Wilkes brothers and Tim Dunn, who have a more conservative agenda, and you can expect them to be challenging you in the primary if you vote against Ken Paxton, vote to impeach. And certainly many of the House members who voted for the articles of impeachment will face Wilkes and Dunn-backed candidates in March. I think on the other side, you have Texans for Lawsuit Reform, which actually was the only group that really tried to do this right in terms of getting rid of Ken Paxton. They went the route of recruiting a top-tier candidate, Eva Guzman. They funded her well, and they tried to campaign against Ken Paxton in the Republican primary. It's just they had very little support from all these other Republicans who now want to get rid of Ken Paxton. They all had an opportunity to do it, but now they're doing it via the impeachment route as opposed to the primary route. Perhaps that's easier.
All right, Gary Polland, if the Senate is the jury, is there any doubt they'll be tampered with phone calls from these folks?
Well, if you read the rules, it shouldn't be happening. In fact, the senators are not supposed to talk to anybody except their staff about what's going on, so that would be improper. But everybody knows that you got the fat cat sitting out there offering sloshes of money no matter what you do. And I think at the end of the day, if you're a state senator, my advice, you're going to get the money regardless of how you vote. So vote based on the merits. How about that? See what the evidence leads and see if the prosecution makes its case, the kind of stuff that Chris and I do every day in the courthouse. I mean, they don't always make their case. They're not always right. Grand juries are not always correct. You know, they say a grand jury will indict a ham sandwich. That can be true, and that's what you do. So they got good lawyers on both sides, and let them litigate. Let them tell the story. Put the witnesses on the witness stand. Check their credibility.
Bill King, your take on outside forces, 30 seconds.
You know, this is a microcosm of the bigger rift inside the Republican Party right now. I mean, you've got this civil war that's been going on at many different levels. This is just kind of the latest battle. And the Republican Party is really kind of tearing itself apart. The only reason they keep winning elections is because the Democrats in Texas are so awful. If they had any kind of credible opposition in Texas, they'd be having problems because of all this. And I don't know, I don't see any resolution to this because I don't think that the Dunns they're going to change their mind. And Wickley's not changing his mind about what the party ought to look like. So I see this battle going on for a long time.
All right, we're going to leave it right there. Still ahead, the decider, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, leader of the Texas Senate, in a pivotal position to make or break Ken Paxton's future. Welcome back. 9 votes if one assumes all the Democrats vote guilty, and I think that's a solid bet. 9 Republican senators must join them to expel Ken Paxton from office. It is simple math, which underscores the linchpin role Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick will play in this process. Aside from his position as all-powerful presiding officer, Patrick is the only player with the stroke to single-handedly sway a sufficient number of GOP senators to impact the outcome. Panel, agree or disagree, Gary Polland?
I agree. I think Lieutenant Governor Patrick will have enormous influence, but I also think he's going to decide where he comes down when he hears the evidence, as should be done. So he'll listen to it. He'll decide whether they've proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt. I think he'll then weigh in his position based on what he believes happened with the evidence.
Mark, your take.
Well, the Lieutenant Governor holds the keys to the Senate. Since he arrived in 2015, he's remade it in his own image to a point now where pretty much all of the senators respect and respond to him. He can, if he wants an acquittal, he can get an acquittal. If he wants an impeachment, he can get an impeachment. If he wants a fair trial, he can get a fair trial. As they have said, what we'll have to see is what he does once the trial gets underway.
Chris?
I think that what Governor Patrick can do, if he wants to get 9 votes, he'll signal that by the way he rules on pretrial motions, not the motions to dismiss, but he rules on all of the pretrial motions himself. And by signaling those rulings on those motions, he can give cover to the senators and get those 9 votes that way by giving them that cover on those rulings and tell them he wants those 9 votes.
Quickly, Bill, final word?
I agree with everything that's been said. I don't think he's got to go through the motion. I think he can just, talk to him and say, this is what I want done. I think that if he wants to convict, he can provide cover in the Republican primary for that. Or if he wants to get rid of it, he could rule in the motion early to dismiss it and hold a majority vote on that, which I think is still the most likely outcome, frankly.
Okay, everybody now on my cue. Who thinks Paxton will be found guilty? Show of hands.
I haven't heard any evidence. So I'm a juror that I'm waiting to hear the evidence. If the evidence is proven beyond a reasonable doubt, I think the Senate will convict. If not, they will quit.
We'll leave it there. Thanks to this week's panel, and thank you for joining us. The conversation continues on a national level next on Fox News Sunday with Shannon Bream. And we'll keep talking here with Watch Your Point Overtime, streaming live on fox26houston.com and on our Facebook page. From all of us here, have a safe and joyful July 4th.